Chapter 28 of Chicago May, Her Story by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Home, sweet home. After I got to Ellis Island, as related in the previous chapter, the bulls took me before the executive committee along with a lot of aliens. Among them were Germans from Panama who were under suspicion, poor folks. Many or most of them were cringing, all trying to prove various citizenships, frightened to the point of death. As for me, I sat down and waited. All the rest were standing. I noticed the men on the bench kept eyeing me up, as if they were wondering at my nerve before the presence. What did I care? Had I quaked or quivered under the royal arms of England, with judges and barristers in their ermine-trimmed scarlet robes? Was I to be afraid of a bunch of healers? When my turn came, the president of the committee read my record, American, English, and French to date. The cops, however, told him that that was not all. The rest was coming on the next boat. This bald-headed old bozo, it seemed, had a sense of humor. He said he knew Eddie Guerin as a boy in Chicago, and he was then a bad actor. "May," said he, "I see you were arrested 6 times for grand larceny the year before you were married in New York. You were discharged in every case. How did that happen?" I pointed over to the bulls and said, "Ask those fellows." He asked them how come. They answered up, "Oh, she robbed sporting men while dancing with them, and they would never appear against her." This president was nice to me. He said I should have remained in the United States. After he had fired a lot of questions at me and had been answered, he said, "Will you help the authorities to prove your American citizenship?" "Sure," says I. "You don't suppose I want to go back to a bloody English detention camp? I've gladly told you all I could remember, and I will tell you anything else I can think of." The police investigated. After 3 weeks, they decided I was an American. Since then, police who knew no better have tried to get me for violating the immigration laws. They always fell down. In the meantime, however, I was herded in with the aliens, awaiting my proofs or disproofs. I shall never forget that experience. The place was literally packed as if with sardines. The government had just seized the Hamburg American Line ships. The officers and crews made the island full to overflowing. Strange as it may seem, however, they had the very best available accommodations and got special food from the doctor's table. The others got food that nearly approached garbage. The first day I was seated with Syrians, Palestinians, Arabs, Persians, etc., with great long beards who ate with their hands. As soon as the waiter placed the food, they grabbed it up. He appeared to be sorry for me. I spoke English, and he was puzzled why I was assigned to that crew. At another table, the German ship officers sat down and ate like human beings. I don't know whether the waiter put them wise or they guessed the situation, but anyhow, they rolled some of their food into a napkin and sent it over to me by the waiter. I was famished. After the first day, I did not go up to the big dining room. I walked by myself into the yard, under the windows of the rooms where the Germans were detained. Although I did not speak or make a sign, I knew they were on the lookout for me. The waiter brought me plenty of food, which I ate in the women's washroom. Some people have hearts in this world. Comes now the first night. I was put into a large room where the beds were hung on chains. In tiers, you had to climb up the chains to get into the upper beds. When the beds moved, the chains creaked. Here was where I spent my first night, no longer a convict, but a free American citizen. The raucous voices of those foreigners, none of whom spoke English, and the variety of tongues in which they vociferated made the place a bedlam. The Tower of Babel had witnessed no such clamour. I got up and sat on the cold stone floor by the door. The air was putrid. I could not sleep. The doctor came along and asked me if I could speak English. I told him yes, and begged him to have me moved. When he wouldn't, I cursed him out for all I was worth. Next day I sat on the bench in the yard all day. I was beyond speech and was dying for a good night's sleep. No pest house for me that night. not if I had to be carried in bodily. The guard was a big, burly Irishman who pushed the immigrants into the kennel as if they were dogs. The rest, dog-like, ran in, after shovings and tuggings, not saying a word. I backed up against the wall. He shouted, "Come in. Do you understand?" I wouldn't answer. He came over to manhandle me. I suppose he thought I did not speak English. I gave him a shove when he was off poise and nearly floored him. Then I let loose with such a volley of American and English abuse that I nearly stunned him. Roughneck that he was, I'll bet he never heard such a choice vocabulary since he came downstairs. When he got voice, he wanted to know how a white lady got into such a position. As long as he seemed to want to act reasonably, I was willing to meet him halfway. I explained matters to him. It often pays to punch first and then caress. He went at once and found a matron. She was a German-American who spoke several languages. All the matrons on Ellis Island are clever women and linguists. She treated me very considerately, for which I was grateful. Almost immediately she hunted up a Polish woman and a Danish lady with her little girl and put them and me into a room together. She said, "When I know about it, I try to keep white people together by themselves." On the following day I was sitting on a bench all alone when an investigator, who was a doctor, came over and talked to me. He said he knew all about me and was very sorry. He also said he would speak to Dr. Graham, a woman doctor in the hospital, and have me kept there while I was detained. Even a kind word and a cracker goes a long way with me. So I went to the hospital, where I was treated with the greatest kindness. The superintendent nurse was a Miss Daly. She was a beautiful woman, and as good as she was beautiful. Among other things, she gave me a nice gown to wear when I was able to get out of bed. The young doctors were grand. They gave me a blood test. This frightened me. I'd never had such a thing put over on me. The result of the test was that I was pronounced in good health. The only thing wrong with me was undernourishment. I hated to leave the hospital when the G-techs came for me. They had to do the last trick before setting me free, as is explained in my story about my attempts to go straight. Before that, however, I had had a good rest. I'd taken on flesh, and Miss Daly had fitted me out with a nice tailor-made gown, underwear, and hat. She kept my other clothes as curios, bless her. It was just as well I had the long wait before I had to see the Dicks. At least I looked presentable. End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Chicago May, Her Story, by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Straight and Narrow Way. Age, punishment, and poverty had brought me to my knees temporarily. I began to cast up the ledger of my life and figure out profit and loss. What had crime brought me in the long run? What had it brought any of my companions? What had become of the considerable sums I had filched from society? According to all the rules of common sense, I ought to show a profit, but no, there was a big deficit to show instead. My overhead was too great. The fences, lawyers' courts, bribe-takers, and leeches had got 9/10 of my gross. I'd had good times and hard times, but I had had to work hard and suffer much for the good times, and the hard times came in spite of me, like bad seasons with the farmer. Good business judgment demanded that I get into another line. All these things were impressed on me on my return to this country in 1917, a criminal American citizeness, deported home through mine-strewn fields at the behest of antagonistic British society. I still had fight left in me, and would have been willing to fight, but for the fact that I was disarmed as soon as I got past Ellis Island and into the hands of the New York police. Much to my surprise, they all greeted me cordially. They acted as if they were willing to let bygones be bygones, and showed me all the consideration they could, according to the rules. Some actually went out of their way to show their sympathy and willingness to help me get started right. When I was ushered into the New York Central Office, I was greeted by John Cray, the chief. He shook hands with me as if I was an old friend, and acted as if he was sorry for my troubles. We had known each other before I left the country. The old-timer Dicks all gathered round me and gave me the glad hand. Some had been wardsmen and on beats when I left. The first thing the chief suggested of all things was to keep the youngsters outside so that I would not be bothered. The next thing I knew, some of the boys were slipping me money so that I would not be up against it. What is more, I was told they knew I had been jacketed by Scotland Yard. One detective, handsome Jimmy Dalton, took it on himself to offer to put me under the care of the Catholic Aid. I was convinced by that time that I wanted to go straight, so I accepted his offer with thanks. He was a respectable man and wanted to help me in a decent way. I was a free woman, but the police had to do their duty under the circumstances, so I was fingerprinted and photographed. I was not brought before the line-up. Whether this was kindness or diplomacy, I don't know. The line-up would have meant newspaper publicity, and the English probably didn't want to answer a possible charge of barbarity for sending an American woman through these submarine lanes. I went to the home of the Aid and waited to see Mrs. Captain Armstrong, the head of the Catholic Aid in America. She never came near me, so the nuns in charge of the home advised me to go to see the Reverend Father X. When I went to his house, he was very cordial. I was dressed like other women by this time, thanks to the money the Dicks had given, but I didn't want a mass. It seemed to express a desire to spend money. When I told the priest who I was, he said, "Oh, yes, I've heard all about you. You were a thief all your life. How can I help you?" I told him I did not want money from him, just some kind of work, no matter how menial, just enough to let me live decently. I even told him I did not want ladylike clerical work or a bank position. He said he was sorry, but that sort of help was out of his jurisdiction. With that, I was dismissed after he asked me if I needed a nickel to ride home. Back I went to the home, gathered together my few belongings, and started out on my own. Among other places, I went to a certain hospital in New York, offered my services to the Red Cross as a volunteer, and was lucky enough to be accepted. The lady superintendent was a Canadian. I told her a yarn about what I had suffered during the war. His Lordship Bishop Keating sent me a letter and enclosed 2 5-pound treasury notes. The communication wished me good luck in the new country, hoped I would bear no ill will against the mother country on account of my misfortune, urged me to have courage, and wound up with some pious drivel. The showing of the letterhead to the superintendent made the road smooth for me. Canadian-like, she was much impressed when she saw it was from a person of great dignity in the community. I was to have got $20 a month and my board and room. Now it was arranged that I was to get 2 nights' work extra a week. All I had were the clothes I wore and a few white dresses to work in. And work! I would be so tired that I would fall asleep in the chair before I could get undressed to go to bed. I never went outside, farther than the roof, during the entire time I was there. I gave the treasury notes from Bishop Keating's to an orderly to have cashed into dollars. He quit his job, got drunk, and I never saw the £10 again. But this did not discourage me. I slaved on. After I had been at the hospital 3 months, I went up on the roof with the nurses and volunteers, and one of the doctors made a group photograph of us. In a couple of days they called me into the office, paid me the few dollars that were coming to me, and told me I had a nerve to crash in there. To this day I have never discovered how they found out about me. Perhaps someone saw my rogues gallery picture and recognized me in the snapshot, or vice versa. I don't believe it was the police. It might have been a stool pigeon. An old lady in the next room to me saw me crying and wanted to know the reason. I told her and explained that I wanted to go straight, but they wouldn't let me. I only had a few dollars because I'd been using my wages to buy clothes. This dame sent me to her daughter, the widow of a letter carrier in East X Street, who turned out to be a very nice lady, having one daughter, a telephone operator. I was to share a room with the young woman. I started out bravely and boarded a cross-town car with my belongings and a handbag containing $14 and some change. When I got to my new home, I opened my bag to pay the woman in advance, but I had only $4. A pickpocket had relieved me of a small purse, which contained a $10 bill. I couldn't help but laugh to think of me being nicked. The woman listened to my explanation and agreed to take $3 on account. I made the dollar stretch as far as it could by eating 5-cent meals, soup, and bread at cheap lunch counters. Soon afterwards I was introduced as a nurse out of employment to a young man who lived next door. He took me out to supper one night, and believe me, I was glad to get a big square meal. We got more and more intimate. He learned my story and asked me to come and live with him. Although I had been walking my legs off trying to get any sort of work, I had absolutely failed. I was discouraged. Why not give up the struggle? I accepted. I became bad again. After the lapse of time, I was laid by the heels and sent to the New York Penitentiary on Blackwell's Island. I was discharged on probation. Mrs. Peacock took me over to New York City and from there to Elizabeth, New Jersey, to work in St. Elizabeth's Hospital. After waiting an hour, we had an interview with the Mother Superior. She agreed that I could work there for a while. The probation officer left, and I was left sitting. Along came an old working nun with a brogue which proved she was as Irish as the pigs of Shoot Hill. "Sure, girl, do you want your dinner?" says she. "Yes, sister," says I. She took me downstairs to the refectory, and I had a good meal of fresh fish, potatoes, and good tea. After eating, I started to put on an old dress I had in my bag to help the waitress when they sent for me to go upstairs. There were 2 young, very snippy sisters dressed in white in the office. They asked me if I could cook for 40 people. I told them that I did not know how to cook, but that I would be willing to do any kind of other work. They then told me they had no other work for me to do, and that I ought to go home before it got dark. I explained that I had no home, that they ought to have told this to the probation office, and that if I was arrested being on probation, no one would believe I was innocent, especially judges or police officials. I also told them no one would believe me if I said Kathleen Nuns had turned me out into the street, a poor woman with no money for lodging, just out of jail, but I couldn't move them, so I left. As a matter of fact, I had $17, but I knew that that would not go very far. I went straight to Newark, thinking to go to the YWCA. I changed my mind, however, and decided I had had enough of religious people for the time being. They all appeared to be alike. Then I walked the streets until I saw a room-to-let sign and rented the hovel for $7 a week in advance. I told the landlady I came from Toledo. A text on the wall of my new home struck my eye at once. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." This made me laugh, because I had decided to apply the text after my own fashion. Within an hour after my arrival in Newark, I dropped into the back room of a saloon in Payne Street and relieved an old bozo of $100. Then I beat it, got a few drinks, and had a swell meal, and so to bed, as Sam Pepys says, and fair contentment with the day's work. In the course of time, I drifted into Detroit and worked there steadily for several months before I got into trouble again. Here I met several friends who took an interest in me and persuaded me to try again. August Vollmer, chief of police of Berkeley, California, a criminologist and a real uplifter, first put it into my head to write the story of my life. I promised him to go straight, and I have kept that promise thus far in letter and in spirit. My first success in the new line of work was when newspaper men helped me to publish 5 stories in the New York American Weekly, for which I was handsomely paid. With this encouragement, and after several false starts, I am now at work on this document under the advice of a lawyer who says I am a chump if I don't go straight and make a living doing it. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Chicago May, Her Story, by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Procurer. I come now to a part of my life which fills me with disgust for myself when I look back upon it. The period is from 1917 to 1925. How the man in the case could have acted the way he did, I can't begin to imagine. How I could have stood for him as long as I did is beyond me or anybody else. As I recall all the circumstances, I cannot even charge up my actions simply to gratitude. My debt on that score must surely have been paid many-fold. No, I was a soft fool, if ever there was one, without rhyme or reason. There was absolutely no excuse. I came back from serving a total of a little more than 10 years in the English prison, resolved to go straight, hoping it would pay better in the long run than continuing in the crook business. New York police welcomed me generously as a fallen foe, and did their part in starting me right. Others in the city whom I came into contact with, however, did not have the same sentiments. Circumstances threw me into the crooked way of least resistance. When I was actually starving, looking for work, chance introduced me to W. Avery, who gave me a good square meal, learnt my history, and suggested that we live together. At first he was fine. We moved out of the neighborhood where both of us lived and got an apartment in the Bronx. I went to Avery's old rooms and did his packing. My few duds could be put into a handbag in no time. He was manager in a downtown restaurant and had to go to work very early. A colored man came to do the moving. I'd been handed a $20 bill to give the moving man, who was known to my friend. A deposit of $25 had been paid on the new apartment, and the balance was to be paid when he moved in. Not having seen colored men for more than 10 years, I was a little timid about dealing with one. I put the 20 on the mantel, went into the bathroom, and shouted, "Mr. Avery said to give you that money on the mantelpiece to pay the landlady of the new place." He called out a little later, "Lady, I can't pay for much of a place with $2. I was all upset and nearly fainted. What would Avery think, knowing about my past? Would he think I'd stolen the money and had gypped him? Would I lose my protector? I went to the phone crying and told him all about it. He reassured me, said there must be some mistake, and ultimately straightened out the whole affair, leaving me clear of all blame. I could have wept for joy. We moved into our home. For the first time in more than 10.5 years, I was my own boss. I could get up when I pleased, go to bed when I pleased, and do as I pleased, but I wanted to please my man. The guy turned out to be pretty good to me at first. He got me a winter coat and promised to take me downtown in a few weeks to give me a winter hat. We bought the hat. On the way home, we went into a saloon, and I had my first drink in more than 10 years. He drank considerable, but I was very abstemious because I knew I was no longer used to liquor. Avery wanted to stop off at 125th Street and 3rd Avenue. When we got on the express downtown, he asked a big-nosed Levantine to give me his seat. The man refused. My companion took him by the nose and lifted him out of the seat, and I sat down. When we got off the train, I was still laughing at the joke, missed my step, and fell all the way from the top down to the bottom of the stairs. My man could neither stop nor catch me. I just rolled as if a cyclone had struck me. When I finally landed, I remember somebody saying, "Her back is broken." Then I passed out. They poured brandy down my throat and spilled it on my coat collar. When I got to the Harlem hospital, the doctors would have it that I was an alcoholic patient, but Avery explained everything. He knew all about me, the very worst, and could have left me at this juncture in my career. Would to God he had done so, and I had never seen him any more. It would have saved me much misery in the years to come. I remained in the hospital a week before they x-rayed me and found I had injured the 6th vertebra. They kept me in that hospital several weeks. That was the terrible winter of 1918, and it was almost impossible to get me home. But finally my man got a car and took me to our apartment, where I stayed for nearly 3 months before I was able to walk and get about again. Eventually I came back to nearly normal. When I did, this guy started to double-cross me. When I look back to go over the happenings of that time, I sometimes think he felt that I owed him everything, and he decided to collect in full. He could count on my gratitude. Avery gave me an old bulldog. When I was not able to move from a chair, the dog sat at the door until the boss came home. He took this dog away when we broke up housekeeping one time, and having opened up another flat for a woman he knew before he met me, gave her the dog. A friend of mine saw her with the animal going into her apartment in Amsterdam Avenue. I found the place in the dark, kicked in the door, took the dog and put him to board in a pet shop in 125th Street. The woman got out a warrant for me for unlawful entry. In the meantime, Avery was visiting me in my joint in 126th Street, telling me he was living with his family in Brooklyn. By this time I went out stealing, and he was sharing the proceeds with me. The bulls arrested me for burglary and stealing the dog. They took me down for the line-up, and everything was explained. Chief Gray said, "This is a smear case. She has robbed nobody. I can see through a stone wall." I walked out, but there had been so much publicity on account of the newspaper stories that I got another apartment at 116th Street and 7th Avenue. It was not long before Avery phoned me at the new place. It seemed that things were not going so well at the little restaurant I had bought for him in Chambers Street. I had not given him any money for several weeks. By this time I had an account in the post office. He told me to draw $100 and to dress myself better. I drew the money, and the two of us went into a place at 127th Street and Lenox Avenue. We had an argument, and it became too late to buy anything. "Give me the money to keep for you, and we will get your things in the morning," he said to me as we were about to separate. I did so. He didn't show up to keep the appointment, but used the money for his own purposes. Then he lost the restaurant and came to live with me again. After this we lived in several cities, principally Philadelphia. I took all of the chances. He took most of the profits. He had become a confirmed procurer, and I was his willing slave, though I complained and got to have less and less respect for him as time went on. During the entire period I lived with him from then on, Avery only worked 1 month as a guard in a munition plant at Amotol, New Jersey, and several weeks as a professional strikebreaker round anthracite mines in Pennsylvania. He was with what was known as a wrecking crew, armed to the teeth. If the poor miners opened their mouths, they were blackjacked. When he took the job, he told me he had hired out as a mess cook. Later I heard the truth from another Fink strikebreaker. As a result of this rotten work, Avery got a scar on his nose and a large scar on his cheek. It seems he rode his horse up the steps of a miner's house to serve him with eviction papers. The hunky's wife was an Irish woman. She told him he was a disgrace to the name of Kelly. According to Avery's story to me, he called the woman a dirty slut. She grabbed a brick and threw it with such good effect that she knocked him off the horse, and he got scars which he would carry to his grave. When I asked him why he did not tell the woman his name was not Kelly but Avery, he replied, "Kelly is good enough to use for a pimp." About 1920 we came back to New York from Philadelphia with the few $1,000s which I had managed to save in spite of all he spent. I furnished a flat in 125th Street West. The very first night he went out and got drunk, I dropped into a place to find him. There I found him with Lily, the woman he lived with in Amsterdam Avenue, boasting how he was going to educate a little girl, Lily's illegitimate child. The poor baby was born in a sporting house in Albany, and no one knew who its father was. You may imagine how I raved. The argument lasted several hours. I got so mad at him that I handed him a couple of punches. He had the gun and blackjack on him that I had bought for him when he worked in the munition plant. He hit me with the jack. I grabbed the gun and took a couple of shots at him and missed. In no time the house was full of cops. The gun was found in the icebox. We were taken over to the 125th Street police station, where, as luck would have it, none of the boys knew me. They thought we were just respectable people having a row. Then we were taken to the Harlem court and sent to the Tombs. While we were locked up, Avery sent out the key of my new flat to this Jane of his, and she and her sister and child went to live there, telling the janitor she was Mr. Avery's wife, and that I was a bad woman. I sent for my warm coat, but got back word that the place was locked up by order of the police. The woman was a drunkard and pawned the best of my things in Avery's to buy liquor. Nobody knew me in the Tombs. The matron put me with the first offenders. After being there a while, it began to look as if I had a chance to be sprung. The Jane, hearing this, tipped off the police as to my identity. The newspapers got the story. I came up for sentence before Judge Collins. He heard the whole story with everybody knocking me. When the officer read off my record, there were loud murmurings of anticipation round the courtroom, everybody thinking a bad character was going to get hers. Imagine the surprise when the judge let me off with a suspended sentence. Bawled out Kelly, gave him 90 days for carrying a gun without a permit, and told him no jury would have convicted me if I had killed him. But you, apology for a man you thought because she was Chicago May, you could abuse her, said this fine judge. It was testified by the doctor that I was black and blue from the blackjacking. Off I went to my apartment, thinking I could stay there until my month was up or get a rebate on my rent. With all the thousands I had stolen, I didn't have a penny. A reporter gave me a quarter for car fare. When I reached 125th Street, one of the boys told me the situation. The other woman was in possession. Kelly had figured I would get a ride, and he would have my place and stand in with the other girl. I got Red Cane, a hard guy, to go with me and drag out the furniture. The doors were locked, so we pushed in a side window and opened up from the inside. I had an express wagon downstairs, having borrowed some ready cash. In less than half an hour, what was left of my belongings were in storage, and the Jane's glad rags were left in the empty flat. The janitor looked on and said nothing. He knew he was up against the gas house gang of Harlem. I went to Philadelphia in order to work in quiet and rehabilitate myself. While I was there, Mr. Kelly sent me word by a friend begging me to send him a little money so that he could buy smokes. Would you believe it? I did so. I knew what it was to suffer in prison, and I did not have the heart to refuse. I not only sent him money, but I took a trip to visit him. I said I was his wife, and they let me in. After I left, somebody handed them the tip, and they were quite peeved. Altogether, I sent him $180 and put another $100 in the post office in his name in case I got into trouble and could not help him when he got out. I also got his clothes out of hock, but could never find my own coat, which the Jane had pawned. When he had done his bit, I met him at the boat in New York. To hear him, you would think he had done 90 months instead of days. I took my furniture out of storage and furnished a creep joint and a private apartment. Avery and I started to live together again. I made up my mind that Avery would have to help me if he wanted to share in the profits of my work. He appeared to do so, but he was afraid to take all of the John's dough, thinking that he would escape the vengeance of the sucker and the law if he only took part. Although I have not mentioned my procurer's name in several of the incidents I have related, he was the helper guy. When I told him how I got him out of the jam in Chicago and lost my fur coat, I was ashamed of being mixed up with him, and yet I stuck by him and worked for him. On one occasion, Avery escaped by hiding in the trunk, and I took the rap on Blackwell's Island. When I got out, I was on parole. Avery nearly dropped dead when I suddenly appeared at a joint in 110th Street, New York, near the police station where he was manager. He was forced to work at something while I was in jail. He was afraid I would break my parole and start work, getting himself and me into trouble. All I could persuade him to do was to give me a drink and some food. I arranged with a lady in Newark, New Jersey, to answer my parole, that is, forward my letter reports, back and forward. Then I went to Boston and started in on the racket, much to Avery's relief, but he didn't mind writing to me and asking me for money. I used to send him enough to live on. When I came back from Boston, where it was nearly discovered by the Dicks that I was on parole, Kelly plucked up enough courage to go with me to Newark and work the racket. I was afraid of being caught in New York. We were not there long before my parole time expired, and I received a nice letter from the commissioner complimenting me on living up to the rules and going straight. From Newark we went over to Philadelphia for a few months while Kelly was away working at some real work. I went up to Portland and Old Orchard, Maine, and back again to Philly, working all the time. To get rid of my parasite, I introduced him to Daisy Rogers, or Lee, who was a booster shoplifter. I met her in the New York pen. She became sorry for me and agreed to take the pimp off my hands. I would not join their enterprise because I knew that end of that game was not profitable and too risky. They operated in several small towns in Pennsylvania, cleaning up. In Boston, however, they were signed out of Jordan and White's store. They had to sign an agreement under threat of prosecution not to enter the place again. Back they came to Philly, and then on to Cleveland, where they made a wonderful killing at the May sales. They blew into Detroit and sent me such flattering reports that I went on there and joined them. I'd been doing pretty well as a result of their endeavors. I got the best of the clothes and some of the money. It was time somebody was working for me. Daisy was a cured drug addict as the result of a course of treatment in a Baltimore prison. Now, however, she had no nerve unless she swallowed a couple of quarts of moonshine a day. From Detroit, I followed them to Chicago, always refusing to boost. It is a cheap employment unless you go in for straight jewelry or penny weighting. Daisy took the rap at Chi, as I have told, and I lost my fur coat. Back, Avery and I came to Detroit, and we laid low. He was always grumbling about how much money I had of his, so I bought him a blind pig. He just coined money. It went to his head to really earn money of his own without having a woman hand it to him. Then he started to stage parties where showgirls and fairies of all sorts held forth. When he came to my apartment, which was seldom, he became quite indignant because I could not see the jolly side of his parties. I told him it was all right to sell booze because everybody was doing it, but I drew the line at filth, vulgarity, and degeneracy. He said I was a jealous crank, and I warned him that the police would close down on him if he went too far. He would not let me come to the place because he was afraid I would start something. One night I watched him. He went into a first-floor room. I knocked gently on the door and got into the place. 3 girls, stark naked, were drinking and smoking, but I paid no attention to the little bums. They knew no better. I was sore on Kelly and hit him with the butt end of a gun, knocking out 2 of his teeth. The whole hotel was in an uproar. He ran out and jumped into his car. What I said that night was aplenty. The police closed the place, and the landlord would have nothing more to do with him. He had to go to the hospital with something worse than the results of my beating. It took him 3 months to get cured, and he had to spend every penny he had ever made. After he left the hospital, he had the nerve to ask if he could come to my apartment, as he was down and out, sick and penniless, and I had a big apartment with an extra room. I told him to come on. I got a colored girl to wait on him. I was out a good deal, and could not be bothered with him. By this time I had saved considerable money, and he swore by his father's memory that if I would forgive and forget, he would try, if I would try, to go straight. We were to start all over again and wipe the slate clean. Kelly still had his car. I told him to drive to Pittsburgh, and I would go by train and meet him there. After he started, I was told that he had gone east with a girl who was described to me. I checked into the Fort Pitt Hotel as soon as I landed in Pittsburgh and took a taxi and went out to the motor terminal for Western Motors. He was alone, but I hit him in the eye just the same because I had heard some other things about him which made me believe he was getting ready to double-cross me. Again Mr. Kelly swore by all that was holy that he was on the square, and he had told me no lie. Just the same, he tried to get me to work Pittsburgh, but I refused and told him the place was too dirty. Once more we came back to Philadelphia. He got a swell apartment in Spring Garden Street. The very first night he went out and got so drunk that he did not know what he had done with his car. What was more, he had lost or given away about $500, which I'd handed him to keep for our expenses. The next thing I knew, he would be out all day long after he got his breakfast. In that respect, I did have some backbone. I never waited on him. He always had to do the housework. Kelly kept spending money and earning none, so I had to go back to work at my trade. I left for Erie, Pennsylvania, in a hurry, one night after a shakedown, and Kelly followed. Then we went to Cleveland, where I did very well. Again, I had enough money to go straight, and he agreed that that was the best thing for both of us. I went to Detroit by train. Kelly had the keys for the baggage. He drove in my car to Monroe to see some real estate man. When I reached my destination, I put up at the Teller Hotel, thinking my good man would arrive next day. I waited 3 days. He had my car, money, jewelry, and baggage. He had gained my confidence because he had not touched a drop since the beginning of our last stay in Philly. As I only had $50, I had to get out of the hotel and get cheap quarters. I thought the baby had been hijacked and thrown into the Detroit River, or maybe arrested, never dreaming that he might have beat it. Along comes a letter from Kelly telling me he has been arrested in Toledo. It was a stall. That is the last I ever saw or heard from the gent himself. As soon as I could manage to get a couple of $100 together, I started out to hunt for him. My investigator traced him to Toledo all right. He was living in a sporting house with a 22-year-old girl, the same one he had taken east with him. He got a little place in Orange Street after the police chased him out of this dump. Then he married the girl, though he had a wife living in Sheepshead Bay. I got a gun and started out for revenge. Before I could lay my hands on him, he and the girl had beat it. The next I heard of them, they were arrested in Cleveland for shoplifting, where they got a fine and left. Then they were arrested in Toledo and held on suspicion. By this time I was very sick. I was advised to forget the whole matter, as not worth the time, trouble, or expense. I was assured some member of the fraternity would get him for a double-crosser. One time I went to Monroe to try to locate him. They wanted me there to put the Mann Act on him, but I refused to do that. I could have shot him like a dog, but I couldn't have him pinched. If I could have got him in the state of Michigan, I could have killed him, and the greatest punishment I would have got would have been a life sentence. I did not want, however, to give my life for him as long as I remained cool. Several times I've heard rumors about him, but I do not know if they were substantial or merely fakes to throw me off his track. I've cooled down considerably, but it would be better for him not to get too near me. The worm turns. I've paid my debt to him. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of Chicago, May. Her Story by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Criminal Jargon. I've often thought it would be interesting and instructive to get up a combination dictionary and encyclopedia of words, names, manners, customs, biographical sketches, etc., connected with the underworld. This was very strong on me when I was in prison reading, but I did not have the privilege of doing it. No pleasures like that were allowed. Some of these days I may get at it, though I realize it will involve a lot of research, historical and otherwise. One of the difficulties connected with many dialects is that they are not perpetuated by their own literature. The result is that they vary from time to time and from place to place. This results in confusion and misunderstanding and differences of meaning for the same words. The context is often the only clue the crook has in determining the meaning of some words. A dick may mean a detective or a policeman. A harness bull, however, is properly only a policeman in uniform. A dictionary such as I've mentioned would be of great benefit to both the police and the educated criminal. It is manifestly impossible for me, within the limitations of this work, to give an adequate terminology, as I've been a badger, payoff, note layer, creep, panel, and blackmailer. Mostly I shall explain them in more detail than some other words, which will be more mere definitions. Others are better qualified to make them clear and to add to the list. Like my French, I understand it better than I speak or write it. The badger is a nocturnal animal which burrows and eats flesh. I've been told of a famous fight between a bulldog and a badger, in which the bulldog won, but was killed. The badger's claws had been smeared with poison. What could be more fitting or for a name for this class of crook, of which I was a member? The game is also called the shakedown. Women, mostly with male assistants, are the badgers, and men are the victims. A man of money and social position is selected or come upon accidentally who cannot afford to call in the police. When he is in a compromising position, a witness appears, and nothing remains but to shake him down. Sometimes the man fights. He either takes his publicity medicine or frightens the badger away. Both may happen. The methods are numerous with many variations. A few will suffice. It is late at night. Along the street comes the proper gent. Suddenly a fake fight is started, and a lady cries for help. Up comes the gent to the rescue. The lady falls into his arms and faints, clinging to her savior. Several things may happen then. If the policeman comes up, the fake hold-up man may beat the gent and swear he was trying to assault the lady. Or the confederate may run away, and the lady will scream and say the gent tried to assault her. Or the fake may run home, and the lady will be so overcome that she will have to be escorted home, where the fake can appear on the scene and demand satisfaction for the seduction of his good wife. Even the retrieving of a handkerchief dropped purposely by a lady has led to badgering. Cabs are favourite places for the sport. If the victim can be lured into a bedroom and fall for feminine charms, so much the better. Before he can accomplish his purpose, the brother or mother appears on the scene to denounce him and demand satisfaction. Not content with this sort of evidence, the better class operators fix up luxurious traps with heavy curtains and other accessories and use a dictograph or camera. It does not take much imagination to figure out the possibilities in various situations. The branches of the Crooks profession overlap each other. Thus a woman may start out to badger an individual and find it advantageous to simply steal. On the other hand, she may decide to shift to the creep or panel game. In general, these operations begin away from the woman's home and wind up there. Let me turn now to creeps. This branch, as its name implies, is pulled off by a confederate who sneaks up to and robs the man's clothes while he is otherwise engaged. As in the case of the badger racket, it may merge into a discovery and denunciation, with throwings out or threats to call the police. Then it becomes badgering. The creeping may be done from under the bed, from an adjoining room, from a closet, or even from a large trunk. Paneling has certain advantages over the two other forms of stealing. The chief reason for this is that some men are satisfied to have a good time playing cards or drinking. It is easy to heat the room to excess and set the examples of taking off coats and outer garments. A heavy chair is placed with his back to the sliding panel in a wall or door. The victim's coat is thrown over the chair, and the victim is seated with his back to the works. The game does not always pan out as planned. The John may have his dough in his trousers or a money belt or in 3 or 4 places about his person. Then tactics have to be changed. The panel may be placed at the back of the bed. The sucker hangs his clothes on the only place allowed to be available, the bedpost or a clothes tree. Wherever he hangs them is where the trap is set. It is very important to remove the incriminating evidence of the panel. In some cases, the door containing the panel may be shifted and an honest door substituted. This last I have spoken about elsewhere in one of my own cases. Oiled windows and dumbwaiters are sometimes used. In case the prey is drugged, there is no need to bother with elaborate machinery. In blackmailing, the sucker generally has himself to blame. He will write letters, sign checks, give autographed photographs, press his card into your unwilling hand, tell his family history, and 101 things he ought not to do. Weak and generous men are easy marks. Even when they have no social exposure to fear, they dread to be laughed at. Most of the Johns pay, and pay dearly, according to their means. Few have guts enough to commit suicide. The blackmailer is insatiable. Sometimes he exposes the dupe after he has been milked dry. The sucker does not even get his money's worth. I've first-hand knowledge of a blackmailing game pulled off on a broker at Broad and Spruce Streets, Philadelphia, some years ago, with the help of a camera and a husband. The broker never squealed, but he went broke all right. He was an old man, and he should have known better. A Philadelphia judge of a prominent family used to drink a great deal and philander with the ladies. One dame persuaded him her ancestors came over on the Mayflower and asked him to take her to New York. When they got over there, she turned the trick all by herself, got him drunk, and took him to a room. He was fool enough to sign the hotel register and be otherwise identified. The Man-White Slave Act hung over his head, and he died a poor man. A Pennsylvania jurist, a holder of public office, and a very prominent man outside of his own state, was blackmailed to the day of his death. He left a will which told the story, admitted he was to blame, and said it all came about by making the first payment. Those who are wise to these stories, and there are many more of them, will know who I mean. I'm in favor of the English law, which I believe allows a married man to commit adultery once, without giving his wife grounds for divorce. The reason is that man is a weak thing in the hands of a designing woman. To his credit, however, it should be said that, unlike the angels, he often is sorry and tries to reform. Many a man is so remorseful after his first slip that he braces up and never repeats. Such a man ought to be forgiven and allowed another chance. I don't care what injured wives may say. God knows they are often to blame for backsliding spouses. Speaking of England reminds me of some more law there. If a man is robbed in the street or in a place publicly adjacent to a street, like a doorway or vestibule, the offense is assault and robbery from the person. The maximum penalty is 20 years. Paneling or creeping only carries 18 months because the John went to the room of his own accord and ought to know what to expect. Here are a few definitions. Some of these expressions have been explained in the text, and some are self-explanatory. This list, which is in the nature of a code, is very far from being complete. It was used by educated thieves for correspondence between members of their gangs. You will notice that the last words in many of these expressions rhyme with their definitions. The object of all this was to throw dicks off the track if they stumbled on any professional correspondence of the members of the gang. Mall buzzers, people who rob women. Hooks, whizzers or dips, pickpockets. Slims, rats, squealers, squawkers, stool pigeons, stools, pigeons, or narcs. English. Police informers. Bulls, dicks, harness bulls, John Elbows or John Laws, police officers depending on the kind. Laying down the quarry, usually called the queer, comes from the French argot and means false or counterfeit money. Laying the note, crooked advertising. Taking a sleigh ride, getting morphine. Snowbirds, morphine addicts. Mrs. White, the name used to and for dope peddlers. Payoff men or cons, confidence men or women. Petermen, yeggs, blowers, safecrackers. Heavy guys, stick-up men or safe breakers. Gun malls or trips, women who steal from men in the street or carry guns. Boosters or hoisters, shoplifters. Stir, can, bird lime, can, iron horse or big house, jail. Bouncer, the plug ugly who throws out the victims who want to make trouble, especially in a house of prostitution. The madam, the proprietor of a house of prostitution. White slaves, inmates of a house of prostitution who cannot get away for various reasons, principally because they are always in debt to the madam. Bracelets, handcuffs. Johns, suckers. Men who are lured by crooks, mostly women. Sods, fairies, sads, maysocks, degenerate or sexual perverts, according to the type. Trailer, helper or assistant. Pinch, arrest. Grand, $1,000. Sentry, $100. Prowlers, hotel prowlers, etc. Sneak, thieves, as the adjective describes. Sparklers, sparks, shiners, stones, ice, English, etc. Diamonds. Touch, either borrowing or stealing. Spring, to set free or beat the case. Call out, to use a stolen check to get baggage, etc. Gopher, one who tunnels to steal. Honky-tonk, gaudy saloon with backroom hangout. Jolt, prison, sentence, dud, substitute or fake, tail, follow or shadow, locating, getting, prospects, way in, to meet, jug, jail, prison or safe, stem, drill, screw, key, panhandler, professional beggar, punk, apprentice thief, hoops, rings, target, outside man, Dan, dynamite, stickers, postage stamps, steerer, shyster lawyer, bindle, blanket or bundle, white line, Dr. Hall, Mickey, alcohol, Chuck, food, DD, deaf and dumb, playhouse, easy prison, clam up, to keep quiet, shive, knife, mulligan, stew, connector, beggar, pennies, money, gump, chicken, box, safe, cons, convicts or confidence men, flop, cheap place to sleep, rap, to put wise or pinch, yen, hop, habit, Irish lasses, glasses, I suppose, nose, dot and dash, mustache, tumble and trips, lips, north and south, mouth, under, beneath, teeth, heart and lung, tongue, out and in, chin, thick and thin, grin, train wreck, neck, chalk boulders, shoulders, chalk farm, arm, woolly, west, breast or chest, brace and bits, breasts, Darby Kelly, belly, songs and sighs, thighs, mumbly pegs, legs, high seas, knees, plates of meat, feet, Oscar Joe's, toes, German bands, hands, long and lingers, fingers, simple Simon, diamond, brothers and sisters, whiskers, ocean waves, shave, Sydney Harbor, barber, leaning fat, hat, tit for tat, cap, Charlie Roller, collar, lamb fry, tie, seldom seeing, BVDs, do and dare, underwear, dig and dirt, shirt, fiddle and flute, suit. Ditch, hide, soft stuff, paper money, smoke, to shoot, smoke irons, guns, whittler, constable, yaffle, to arrest, rooting, working, stealing, office, signal, batter, beg, doss, camp, jungle, Crooks territory, script, money, paper money, on Jane, Tijuana, Mex, jungle, buzzard, hobo, sneak thief, preys on his own kind, bows, hobos, lusher, lone drinker, frisk, search, steal from person, lump of lead, head, bonny fair, hair, tears and cheers, ears, center lead, forehead, chips and chase, face, mince pies, eyes, ivory float, coat, uncles and aunts, pants, Johnny Rousers, trousers, Sunday best, vest or dress, Oscar hocks, socks, ones and twos, shoes, daisy roots, boots, Joe Rook, smoke, cherry ripe, pipe, rattle and jar, car, gay and frisky, whiskey, near and far, bar, rise and shine, wine, oh my, dear, beer, elephant trunk, drunk, bottles and stoppers, coppers, shovel and broom, room, weeping willow, pillow, loop the loop, hoop or ring, bees and honey, money, block and tackle, watch and chain, heap of coke, bloke, fields of wheat, street, piper, hide, sick, looker, see. End of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of Chicago, May, Her Story by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Aliases, Crooks, and Others. In the course of my career of stealing, I adopted various aliases. There were also social and business reasons for this. During the life of my parents, I kept my family name, Desmond, hidden from even my closest associates. After I had acquired a reputation as a crook, I had to change the name given me by my confrères to outwit the law and stool pigeons. I did what a spy would do in enemy country. The lawyers told me the common law permitted the changing of names at will without permission of court. They said it could only be used against me as prima facie evidence in case I got pinched. I found out by experience, however, that it was also used against me in fixing sentence after conviction. In Chicago, I adopted the Christian name of May, dropping Beatrice, which was given me at baptism, and which was the name known to my uncle's family and neighbors. My first husband, Churchill, called me B. At first, as a kid in Chicago, I did not need more than one name tacked on to the last name of my husband. His name was an asset in my business because he was a well-known crook. Later, and before I went east, I adopted a middle name, Vivienne, for no particular reason except that I liked it. Aside from sounding Frenchy, it was the stage name of a chorus girl of whom I was very fond. Then I rang the changes: Miss M. V. Churchill, Mrs. May V. Ditto, M. Vivienne. But as I became more expert in daring, business grew better. I was arrested oftener. It became absolutely necessary to switch to other names. Thus I was a Latimer, a Kelly, an Avery, and a Wilson at different times. Some of the last names were semi-legitimate. I was married twice and was a common-law wife 7 times. Hence I had a right to assume the names Churchill, Sharpe, Guerin, Smith, Considine, Thompson, Gore, Avery, Kelly, Alivato of Detroit, etc. Some of these names are duplicates, as in the cases of Smith, Considine, and Avery Kelly. Nowadays I go under the name of Mrs. May Churchill Sharpe. But to continue with the aliases, I've had more than I can recall. I've been known as Lillian White. This was in Philadelphia. In Brazil I was known as Mary Williams. The name Rose Wilson once fitted me for a couple of months. Mary Brown was my name part of the time in Detroit. This last was the cause of a near slip. On one occasion I had recrossed the Detroit River from Windsor, Canada, where I had a little business to attend to. It had only netted me about $50, but that was enough to keep me from being picked up on a vagrancy charge. Just before this lucky touch I had been completely broke. Before I went to my room I had an errand to do in Woodward Avenue. Along came a harness bull and nabbed me for no reason at all. He had a poor hunch. I was taken to the Canfield station. The inspector accused me of having been there before and of being a nigger hustler. I denied the charge as to time, place, and association. I admitted, however, that I had been at headquarters thinking I was foxy. The inspector then piped up that the record he was examining, in an effort to nail me in a lie, was for a girl of 21. It had been years since I looked that delightful age. This heartened me considerably, so I took a chance and urged that all the Mary Browns be looked into. As luck would have it, the search proved I had never been at Canfield before, because all of the Mary Browns were around 20. But people in my former profession have other troubles besides those attending the use of a phony name. For one thing, even the smart cops make mistakes. For another, would-be rivals try to steal your thunder. One time an actor named Hastings got into a jam because some dame accused him of being too familiar with little girls. It was a blackmailing scheme, probably. The hussy was sent to the house of the Good Shepherd in New York. She said she was Chicago May. I was given that name by the gang when I first came to New York in 1894. I was never committed to the Good Shepherd. The newspapers, in describing the affair, said I squandered money, throwing it into the street and egging on the poor kids to fight for it. I've given hundreds of dollars to kids, but they did not have to work that way for it. There was also a very small girl who called herself Chicago May. She was known by most of her gang, however, as Stella Richardson, O'Malley, or Fitzgerald. She got Gold-Tooth May handed to her once in a while. They say she came from San Francisco. I'm told she has been dead for years. On another occasion, the daughter of a New York baker named Vetch got into some sort of trouble in which there was rough stuff. When this got into the papers, I was surprised one day to find I was the heroine of the combat. For years afterwards, that little Dutch girl's brawls were blamed on me. An older woman, May Murray, gave herself my name. May Murray was a shoplifter who could carry 2 seal jackets in an elastic arrangement she had under her skirt. The last I heard of her, she was brought back to New York from California, claiming to be the original Chicago May. There were also two sisters born in New Jersey, one of whom was supposed to be Chicago May. They were dope fiends and boosters. I knew many girls in the New York Tenderloin, but I could not keep track of all of them. After the Western gang of which I was a part got operating between America and Europe, I did not always stay long enough in Manhattan to hear of every case in which my name was taken in vain. Sometimes I only stayed for a couple of days. At various places in my history, I mentioned names in connection with the details of incidents, avoiding repetition as much as possible, except where it is necessary to show a connection with something else. I shall relate now some of the facts connected with a few of my many crooked friends and acquaintances. Gracie Mansfield was one of my friends who was notorious. She never used my name. New Haven was her home. She was the cause of a young man very highly connected being expelled from Yale. After that affair, she was locked up in Auburn prison for some minor offense. The last time I saw Grace, she was in the New York pen and hadn't changed very much. I was acquainted with Adam Worth, or Raymond, as I knew him. He did not amount to much as a crook. Through his ignorance he made history. One night he was wandering up and down Bond Street, London, when he happened to cast his eye on Christie's Place, where, as I tell elsewhere, my friend Annie Gleason failed to lift the string of pearls. At the time in question, Worth had a pal in jail and had no money to spring him. Suddenly he got a brilliant idea for him that it would be the cheese for him to break into Christie's art department, steal a painting, sell it to Dan McCarthy or some fence for a few pounds, and get his sidekick out. No sooner thought of than put into execution. The shop was robbed, and the undiscriminating Mr. Worth cut a painting out of its frame, rolled it up, and took it to the fence. As soon as the foxy fence saw the oil, he knew he had a white elephant on his hands. It was too valuable, however, to return or dispose of for the time being. The next day the news was buzzed that the original Duchess of Devonshire by Gainsborough had been stolen. There was the devil to pay. Did you ever hear of such dumb luck? It now became a question of how to hide the elephant till the storm blew over. The Dicks were specially worked up because the papers were razzing them for inefficiency. To make a long story short, the painting was smuggled out of England in the bottom of a trunk. It ultimately found its way to Chicago and laid there in Hinky Dink's barrel house for years. Finally, an agreement was made by which the famous painting was restored to the owner for $20,000 and no questions asked. I've been told the proceeds were divided between the then possessor of the picture and the three others, but I do not know this of my own knowledge. One thing I do know, however, and that is that the original thief was too much of a nut to get anything. The money did not begin to represent the cost of cash, time, and worriment of all the people engaged in passing it along. In an effort to complete my pictures of crooks I have known, I shall mention some here very briefly. Kemmy Goldberg and Silverman were fences in London, friends of old Dan, the thief who was used by Guerin one time to trap me. They were associated with him in a big pearl deal which caused quite a furore at the time. Grimshaw was a penny waiter who got £4,000 worth of wares from a jewellery salesman in the Café Monaco, London. Bruce and Williams were friends of Becky Hawkins Cohen, one of the family from whose house Finch the Protestant was buried in state as I described elsewhere. They fell with her at Brighton, England, for the pennyweight. Bruce was mixed up in a big will case in 1916 and had gotten 14 years for his rascality as a con. Silent Pat, one of the best international prowlers, is in London at the present time. Among the heavy stick-up men were Bill Armstrong, Billy Trott, John Pickett, and Leeds Bob Williams. The last three did time for Mappin and Webb's Jewelers, place in Regent Street, London. Hattie Rock was the phony kid's girl. She was the one who brought the news to Charlie Smith and me in the Soho restaurant, London, that Guerin had been released from the extradition imprisonment and was on the warpath looking for us. Within an hour or so, Guerin had been shot, and we were in the toils, thanks to lying and prejudice. Hattie was living in Detroit the last time I was there. May Bonner went to Auburn Prison, New York, for bigamy. Joe Cherry died on Blackwell's Island, New York. May Collins and May Hess were creep joint workers. Nell Welsh committed suicide at Dan the Dude's farm in New Jersey. I met Margaret Riley in the New York pen. She got life in Michigan. She had just had a baby in Detroit. I think it was a shame they sentenced her for such a long stretch. She had 7 children. I wrote her about the first of this year, but I have received no reply from her. I intend to write some women I know in that state to see if they cannot do something to help her. She is out on the farm. I knew Grace McIntyre in Detroit, having met her in the county jail, where we both had a private room. She was very good to me at the time I was sick. I did not, however, care for Gracie's way of living. She lived off the prostitution of poor, unfortunate girls. Ruby Michaels was a prominent London fence. He was an agent for an old Jew in Johannesburg, South Africa, by the name of Levi. Before Ruby was king of the fences, the throne was occupied by Fireballs of Petticoat Lane. He died in prison thanks to a careless Christian wife. The Cincy Kid, or Oswald, was an Australian who tried to harm me in London. Charlie Smith worked hard to trace him for my protection, but he disappeared from view. When Smith got out of the jam he got into when he was unsuccessful in using the keys to rob the man, as I tell in another place, he was not released because I threatened to blackmail the judge, as the Dicks thought. They could not understand how he was sprung, so they made up that cock-and-bull story. The real facts were that Judge Wallace was a kind-hearted man and thought the cops were riding Charlie. It was his first year on the bench, and he had not had time to become hardened. I had a friend go to see him. Smith wrote him a letter and told the judge he wanted to go straight back to the States. The police were certainly sore about the outcome, for they were sure they were going to get a conviction and a long sentence. I'm frequently asked how often I've been arrested. As nearly as I can tell, the score stands as follows: United States about 15 times, in France once, in Brazil once, and in England about 7 times. Comparing this with the length of stretches, the record is United States about 2 years, France 3 years, Brazil 10 days, and England about 10 years and 3 months. Of the grand total, I served 10 years and 22 months on charges of which I was innocent. I deserved, however, to get the balance, about 3 years and 5 months. If I had been in prison for only what was coming to me, I would have considered myself very lucky compared with most crooks. I was able to beat the big majority of my arrest cases. They were very, very few compared with the total number of my forays on society. Dan Cherry's first wife was Josie Cherry, who was Gleason's first partner. She was a booster and died in the Blackwell's Island pen. Dan's next wife was Maria Hill, a swell booster. Following her came Molly Davenport, the notorious Toledo madam. Years ago, Dan worked a pennyweight with a partner in London. Once he borrowed one of Annie Sullivan's earrings so as to be able to tell a jeweler that he wanted to match it for his wife, who had lost its mate. It was worth $500 to him because he pawned it at the usual 1/3 rate and sent Annie the broker's ticket. Although she was stealing every night, she wanted to have poor Dan pinched, but her lover, George Pell, would not stand for it. Anyhow, Dan returned the money. He had only borrowed it because he needed some ready cash to go to work in Paris at the time, about 1900. A couple of years ago, Dan Cherry was living in Detroit, running a blind pig. He was married to a beautiful young Italian girl. Although he was then an old man, he was as straight and well set up as a young fellow. He and his wife treated me royally. Dan wanted to give me some money, but I did not accept this kind offer. I was steering clear of the police at the time. The misuse of my name has been funny at times. My father's name has been given as F. Leander Vetches, the Dutch baker who was the father of the Mary I referred to. Ethel Dowdell was accused of stealing $28,000 from a gent in New York, which was gratifyingly large even for Chicago May, but I was in Europe at the time. Mabel Williams might have kept my name out of it, though they charged her with only stealing a toy Japanese terrier. I'm not fond of toy dogs. A Great Dane is more in my line. I like police dogs too, but they insult that noble brute by giving him such a name. Avery Kelly was so afraid of being mixed up with the real Chicago May that he told the Dicks I was Mary O'Malley one time when we were pinched. Walter Jones was an actor who was connected with the show 1492, which ran during the time of the Chicago World's Fair. It was said I took money from him without his consent, according to the newspapers. I didn't, and he didn't say I did. I nicked a naval officer one time who was fool enough to tell me his right name. I helped him out when he got into a jam by telling the newspaper boys his name was Samuel L. Williams. The Jerry agents never got after me in New York for teaching children to be pickpockets. That is a newspaper canard. My maiden name was never Go-Get, and I never was the adopted daughter of Mrs. Ricks, a museum proprietor's wife. If you consult the newspaper files, you will find I have been accused of being successively Richards, Fitzgerald, Miller, Fletcher, Omerley, Smith, Nelson, and O'Donnell, to mention a few of them. But my victims were the clever guys at handing out names for themselves when they had the gall to appear against me. One innocent clergyman said he was a salesman by the name of Louis Rosenblatt. The cops asked him if he was a Jew and laughed when they put the question. I asked him who he was salesman for, and he tried to freeze me by saying he did not want the firm to get mixed up with low women. When I stole, it was generally money I took. The reason was that the fences got most of the chattel profits. If the law would make these vultures more vulnerable by revising its rules and allowing more testimony of, by, for, and against conspirators, there would be more convictions and less crime. Usually I did my business with such cattle through third persons. A pawnbroker at King's Cross, Whitechapel, London, was a fence, but for that matter, many pawnbrokers used to be fences. Becky Lockett did time in Brighton, Birmingham, and Liverpool. She was mixed up in one job in which she was charged with stealing £4,000 worth of jewelry. Detective Inspector Stockley, the one who let his imagination run riot in my case for the Guerin shooting, was the bête noire for Becky. He could only see me as a blackmailer, and he went the limit using my letters. He at least had not the vivid imagination of the New York Dick who said I had jaws like a bulldog and bit men's jewelry out of their cravats while hugging them in cabs or while dancing with them. Becky's husband Jimmy was the one who got the pigeon ruby I mentioned. Poor dear Countess Makievicz, my fellow prisoner in Aylesbury, died in July 1927. She was a real Irish patriot, sacrificing money, position, health, and freedom for liberty. After all had been gained except the bare shadow of independence, the shanty element turned her down at the polls. She who had done so much for them. What between those ingrates and the English, she died a martyr, broken in body and spirit. Old Pat Hill, as he was better known, Pat Crow, was one of the best crooks in his day for all-round work. He went in mostly for burglary, but did not despise the lighter branches of the profession, like prowling. He, like most of the other members of the underworld, rose to eminence only to decline until he lost out completely, begging at the L-steps in New York. Some years ago he and Uncle Barney Young and another old man were sent to the Detroit House of Correction. While they were doing their stretch term of imprisonment, Mrs. Young worked at the Detroit Country Club as a waitress, supporting herself and helping to support the wives of the other two men. Barney's wife even took in washing in her own home, which she owned in her own right. Now Pat Crow had a chicken wife who thought more of pleasure than principle. She had the brass to stage parties in the Young home, even having a Negro as one of her guests. Meanwhile, the wife of poor Barney was out drudging. Mrs. Crow was young enough to be Pat's granddaughter. Years ago, the beauteous Marie Hill was the wife of the then young, handsome Pat. She was a high-class shoplifter. 40 years ago she boosted wearing a bustle and a bonnet tied under her chin, but styles changed. The flapper wife sent to New York for her hats. Detroit millinery was not good enough. Things are different in more ways than one nowadays. May, I never knew her last name, was a clever woman who played the high heel, begged, over in the East Side, New York. What that baby did not know in that game wasn't worth knowing. She could and did ring all the changes. The police were always one jump or one day behind her. If she did not have an infant in arms, she was the wan, pathetic wife of a crippled husband, dutifully sticking by him in sickness and sorrow for the edification of a world which was too lazy to investigate for fraud and too ashamed to appear niggardly. Sometimes she herself was crippled, sometimes only blind. Her voice was worth a mint, so meek, so modest and plaintive. Anna Robinson was a lovely American girl who made a hit in Europe. In Paris she used to wear a neckband which was said to have been given her by Leopold, the late king of the Belgians. It was a beautiful piece of jewelry studded with all sorts of precious stones, so that it sparkled with all the colors of the rainbow. Our mob used to call it the king's dog collar. Anna used to pal with the girl high up in society who went under the name of Mrs. Wilson. Both of them were high grade in their crooked work. Neither of them would stoop to anything low, by which I simply mean they only fished for large suckers and used nothing but the most expensive tackle in their angling. But what was the end of all this magnificent success in crookery? This society man's mistress lost out. She came back to New York and lived in Chinatown. At first she put on airs and was queenly in the use of money and the hop, but she sank lower and lower until she became a regular dope fiend and bum, so poor that she would sell herself to the devil to get a few dollars to satisfy her cravings. The sweet-faced Anna Robinson, formerly of La Crème de Demi-Monde, died in the Metropolitan Hospital on Blackwell's Island. I think her poor sister buried her. Poverty and disease had vanquished her whom the highest in society had worshipped. She had become an incurable dope fiend also. The phony kid, husband of Hattie Rock, was Harry Carlton, son of a Pittsburgh doctor. He was the greatest penny waiter that ever lived. Charlie Smith and he did time in the breakwater in South Africa. John the waiter and he did a long stretch in Edinburgh. Once Annie Gleason and the kid tried to hire out with the diamond cutters in Holland, but a Chicago businessman recognized Annie, and the police chased the pair out of the country. If the kid hadn't been full of dope most of the time, he would have been a wonder. Hearing somebody say he would steal a red-hot stove, he proved it just to show off. Once he stole shoes for his wife, which he would have considered right enough if they hadn't turned out to be all left-footed. End of Chapter 32. Chapter 33 of Chicago May, Her Story, by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Temporary addresses. One time I got into a jam over in New York. I had no money, so I borrowed car fare and went to Philadelphia to see if I could change my luck. All I had was a tailored suit and some furs. I picked up a couple of men and robbed them the first night, so I had enough to rent a room and get something to eat. Then I started to work at my trade. I must say this for the Quaker City cops, that none of them ever asked me for a penny. It was a cheap town, but the overhead was low, so on the whole the profits were as great as in other more flashy cities. But I had bad luck on this trip. I got the flu. Every time I appeared to be getting better, I would catch a fresh cold. I had to go out to steal to pay my rent and board. When I was almost down and out, I borrowed $50 from a lawyer on my promise to get some decent work and go straight. I paid him back the money, but I didn't go straight. On the contrary, I got better and worked the city until I was able to save nearly $1,000. The Dicks did not know me, so I had a pretty free hand. I returned to New York fairly prosperous. On another occasion, I beat it to Philly when the Bulls chased me out of a New York domicile. On this occasion, I had a man with me and opened a creep joint in 10th Street. We had the use of the whole house and brought the Johns in through the alley, so that it was very hard for them to find the house again. One night I met a wise sucker from New York. He told me he was a corset salesman and wanted to know if he could fit me with a pair. I told him not to bother about the old gag, because I did not wear such harness. This was on an Easter Eve. We passed a confectionery store, and he bought me a large chocolate egg. I had Alice put on it because I told the guy it was for my little daughter, for whose sake only I was willing to run the streets. When I told him I was not like the Chestnut Street gold diggers and would be satisfied with whatever he could afford to give me, he became very enthusiastic. I rushed him hard. He hung up his clothes almost over the head of the man I had planted in the room. The creeper got $400 in the twinkle of an eye and slid out. When he had salted away the dough downstairs, he started pounding on the front door. I yelled, "It's the owner," and the John got scared. Then I leaned out of the window and said I would be down in a few minutes. In the meanwhile the sucker was ready, and I sneaked him out through the alley to the little back street. Inside of an hour Mr. John was back, was met at the door by my man, and wanted to come in because he had dropped something. The creep said he couldn't let him in, that he only roomed there, and that the landlady, a white-haired, very old woman, was out. Next morning we got a letter addressed to the man of the house, saying the sucker would call at the house the following night. I went out that same afternoon, met an old sea captain in Green's Hotel, 8th and Chestnut Streets, and nicked him for nearly $750. My fellow touched him by coming into the house with a dead latch key. He must have been frightened at seeing so much money all at once, because he dropped a century on the floor. I promptly stepped on it and retrieved it. When I got rid of the old bird, we left immediately for little old New York. No more was heard by me from the captain or the guy who was going to have his rights the following evening. The next time I worked in Philly, my parole from Blackwell's Island had expired. I wanted to go to a nice, decent sort of a place where I could save some money and tackle bigger and more exciting things with a prosperous front. My man and I got an apartment in North 17th Street. We lived quietly there for some time, picking up a few dollars once in a while. Then I moved down to 11th Street near Sansom, and I cleaned up everything that came my way. I never had one pick up. How I escaped and so close to New York, too, I cannot understand. I lived in the streets and in the lobbies of the big hotels, especially in the Walton and the Adelphia, right in the center of the city. When Smedley Butler came to clean out the town, I was running a creep joint in 11th Street. He got the police so nervous that the crooks had a comparatively easy time of it. The cop on the beach, seeing me with various men in the street, told me I would have to stop taking Johns to my house. I thanked him and stopped. It was a furnished room establishment. I moved everything of value out of my rooms and had my trailer follow the suckers. Then I had 3 keys made, one for my victim, one for the trailer, and one for myself. I would stroll along Walnut or Chestnut Streets and the cross streets. When I selected a John, I would put him wise, tell him the town was shut up tight, and give him a key. He would go where I sent him and up into my reception room. I followed later with an armful of groceries, generally bread and potatoes, which I gave to the landlady afterwards. Sometimes I would steer several Johns this way in one evening, always having different kinds of groceries on my arm. The cop might have got suspicious if he met me several times with the same sort of stuff. Sometimes he would not see me at all. He and the other dicks had a blue funk on account of the General of Marines. The cop couldn't object. I was always alone on the street. If the sucker was timid, the trailer was at the door and would say, "If you are Miss Wilson's friend, walk right up, 2nd story back." One night I met an Englishman from New York and got more than $1,000 from him. I just grabbed my little bag, left him with a swell package of eats, a half-quart of moonshine, a $50 bill, and some change. I wanted the poor fellow to have enough to pay his hotel bill and his fare back to New York. I left on the next train for Erie, Pennsylvania, and slept soundly all night. After working in Detroit for some time with varying success, I decided to go back to Philadelphia to visit the Sesquicentennial. I was there before the big show was fully installed for visitors. The trip was delightful and profitable. I met some wonderful Shriners, and I'm sure they remembered me. After having worked pretty steadily, I decided to take a much-needed rest. The night before I was to go back to my man in Detroit, I was walking along Chestnut Street window shopping. 2 ugly-looking brutes appeared to be following me. I went into a child's restaurant at the corner of 10th Street to get rid of them. They trailed me when I came out. When I looked into Bonwit and Teller's window, they stood beside me. As I turned to go home, they wanted to know what I was doing. Because I told them I was no hustler, they pinched me. The next morning I had a lawyer when I came before the judge in the misdemeanor rents branch of the municipal court at 12th and Wood Streets. My representative and I had never seen each other before. I'd phoned him because one of his fellow club members had recommended him to me. He did not know I was Chicago May. I convinced him I had done nothing to be arrested for, though I confessed I had a record which would hurt me if I was held. What does this gent who looked and acted like Abraham Lincoln do but get up and tell the judge it was an outrage for cops to pinch a lady who was doing nothing, even if she was a crook, and talk very friendly-like to his honor, who appeared to know him well. Bless it if the judge didn't discharge me in the custody of the lawyer. I beat it out of the city. This arrest is one sample of the inaccuracy of my official record. It is not in it. I was given an indefinite sentence to the penitentiary on Blackwell's Island, New York, as the result of the Romanian falsely swearing I had beaten and robbed him, whereas my trailer had only punched him in the street for pestering me. I made up my mind to take matters philosophically. This notwithstanding, I was sore at the injustice of the commitment, but then I felt it could be no worse than the other longer one at Aylesbury, England. The prison commissioners were pretty good to the women, giving most of them 12 to 15 months for a go out of their 3 years. When my turn came, I got 30 months, virtually the whole term. The prison officials hesitated in telling me the sad news, but I laughed. However, just the same, I got busy. Mrs. Lilly, the lady superintendent, wrote to a commissioner for me. The next time he came to the prison, I had a private interview with him. I told him the truth, everything. He must have believed me because he started right away to try to get me a parole. By that time I had done nearly 6 months. Commissioner Lord, one time Deputy Commissioner of Police, was harder to convince than Kruger, but at my suggestion he asked Edwin England, the officer in the case, what he thought about it. The report was satisfactory. When the commissioners were willing to parole me, Judge Freshy wouldn't sign the papers. The matter hung fire for nearly 12 months. Finally, His Honor signed on conditions that I left the state of New York. While I was on Blackwell's, now Welfare Island, I worked hard. For 6 months I treadled at a sewing machine. The rest of the time I was the dentist's assistant. Dr. Belaine treated me fine. This work was not hard. The food was plentiful. If it had been well cooked, it would have been better than that of the average poor family outside. But the trouble was the chef belonged to the old regime and thought any sort of cooking was good enough for the prisoners. Mrs. Lilly tried hard to raise the morale of both prisoners and matrons. She had plenty to contend with. While I was dickering with the tough Italian about joining him in a dope running and peddling ring, I had occasion to go to Boston. Mind you, I was on parole from the New York pen. I pulled several jobs in the Athens of America and once came near being arrested and caught in a parole break. The way it came about was this. I had become acquainted with 2 young Danes, very swell boys, brothers. We were the best of friends. The lot of us were out together for 2 days. Once I nicked them for some money, but they thought they had spent it. In fact, they never actually counted their money and never knew exactly how much they had. I became tired after the second day and went to my room. The boys knew where I lived. Late that night there was a pounding on the door. The landlady looked out of the window, and there was one of the Danes and a uniformed policeman. She brought them upstairs, and I asked what was wrong. The Dane accused me of stealing his watch. I was scared sick, but not on account of the watch. My red parole card was lying on the bureau. As soon as I could, I sidled across the room, got the card, and slipped it to the landlady. Fortunately, the cop did not get wise. He was very polite and merely asked me if I objected to him searching the bureau drawers. "Help yourself," said I. After he had completed his examination, he asked everybody to step out of the room, excepting me. "What's coming now?" thought I. "Look here, miss," he said to me in an ingratiating way. Give me the watch, and all bets are off. If you don't want to trust me that much," he continued, "just help me, and leave it where I can find it." With tears in my eyes, I told the bull everything about the party. I urged him, for God's sake, to search the Dane, and search his room and his brother's apartment. I told him on my word of honour I would wait where I was until he returned. The cop, after a little more persuasion, left with my late companion to go search him and his room. As soon as they were gone, the landlady and I started to pack my things for a quick getaway. She knew that I would ride, innocent or not, if I was arrested, with that parole staring me in the face. I was just about to start when back the cop came with the Dane, mad as a boar with a sore ear. The guy had rolled up the watch in his handkerchief and stuffed it into his back pocket. Maybe the copper didn't kick the Dane a good, stout, swift one and chase him. Through that policeman's kindness of heart, I'd been saved from having to finish my term in jail. Did I forget to reward him? I rather think not. After getting tired of trying to find my man Kelly, as elsewhere recounted, to wreak vengeance on him, I went to Toronto, Canada, to try to forget what a simp I had been. I met an Englishman at the Queen's Hotel. I took him into camp for £200, but aside from a couple of little touches, I did not stay long. During the time I was under cover because I'd stolen jewelry from a salesman to whom I had been introduced by an actor, the details of which I have told, I was sent by Detective Becker to New Haven, Connecticut. I got money out of several students and had fights with some of them. They were boisterous kids and could give cards and spades to many rounder guys who claimed to be hard-boiled. At a very jolly party, I got a seal ring from one of these young fellows. We were drinking champagne punch, and he got disgustingly tight. It turned out the ring was a very old family heirloom. The next day there was the devil to pay. A fraternity brother of the Black Sheep came to see me about returning the ring. He, like a yap, explained how valuable the plain gold circlet was. I would have given it up for the asking before that, but now my price went up. I asked $1,000 flat, and a signed statement that the ring was returned voluntarily without promise of reward. I got my demands in full, but the town became so hot for me, I was glad when I could go back to my gang in New York, the jeweler having been satisfied. I ought to have asked for more, because the guy could not stand publicity, but he was kept so short by his family that the fraternity brothers had to chip in to help him out. I hope they were repaid with interest when the young man came into his estate. I hope also the young man learnt a lesson not to play with strange ladies. When I was in Paris on one trip, I was introduced to old Jim Coffey, whose right name was Turner. His wife was known as the American citizen, though she, unlike her husband, was not American-born. A Mrs. Wormsley, who worked with a swell mob in Belgium, gave me the introduction. This was after she had helped George Williams rob a jewelry store in Brussels. If the pair had not thrown the empty cases into the sea at Ostend, and if the tide hadn't washed them back, she wouldn't have got 5 years for the affair. As I was saying, I was introduced to Coffey and helped him pull off a game for which he was noted. He wanted me to fill in because the dame who played nurse to his wife was ill. Mrs. Coffey was naturally lame. That was the only honest-to-goodness thing about the works. She came over to Paris from London, and I took her in a wheelchair into a jewelry store. I was dressed like an English nurse. The old man was rigged up like a Church of England bishop. The wife felt faint, so the Right Reverend begged to be excused from purchasing that day because his better half was very delicate. We had rented an apartment in the Champs-Élysées, where today you would have to be a millionaire to afford quarters. Our place had a getaway from the bedroom. That is why it was selected. The next day, after calling at the jewelry store, we sent the old lady home to London. His lordship the bishop then went back to the store and asked, as a great favour, that they send an attendant with a tray of diamonds for madam to select from. In due time the shopman arrived at our rooms. I, the trained nurse, met the man and parked him in the reception room. The Reverend came out and explained that his wife was in bed, having had one of her bad days. The old gent certainly could speak beautiful French. The man parted with his tray to me. I went to the bedroom. The bishop followed. We admired the stones in audible English, all the while changing into our coster outfits. Down the back stairs went old Coffey and the diamonds, dressed in corduroys and earrings, with a red handkerchief round his neck. I was at his heels, wearing a large knitted shawl and white apron with a black straw hat and brogues. We kept up the chatter until we donned our togs, and then for the station. I suppose the shopman waited and got nervous waiting. I imagine him finally summoning up enough courage to enter the sick lady's boudoir. No doubt the robbery was finally reported, but we never heard any more about it. Coffey worked this trick in various garbs, from priest and parson to nobleman, military, naval officer, giving enough variety of plot in different cases to keep it from becoming too monotonous and coincidental. Scotland Yard had plenty of his disguises sent back from France. The English dicks could do nothing to help their French brothers. The offence was not extraditable at that time. Coffey was a subject of Her Britannic Majesty, having served in the army. Eddie Guerin, by a newspaper ad, lured me to Dan McCarthy's place in Newton Street, Holborn. He was jealous of baby Thompson, with whom I was then living, and would not give me up. I was so afraid of the man that I became his slave until I could make my escape without fear of immediate punishment. He sent my maid Skinner for my clothes and took me to the Ivanhoe Hotel in London. I was too afraid to yell for help, and it was against the crook code to squeal. This was before the Dicks had discovered Eddie, arrested and held him for the extradition proceedings, all of which he blamed on me. McCarthy had a small store on the first floor and lived upstairs. It was a veritable den of thieves. His old woman, Julia, was a cripple. She was constantly telling her rosary beads, praying. It was funny at times to be there and hear her. She would get as far, maybe, as Holy Mary, Mother of God, and happen to look out of the window. Tap, tap, tap would go her cane on the floor above, and she would shout down the stairs, Dan, Dan, Dan. God blimey, the elbows, police, are across the street. Guerin had my trunks packed by Skinner and took me to Aachen, Germany. Before we left for that place, we went out in public eating, but I dared not try to escape. On one occasion, when we were dining at Thatcher's, he drew a gun and said he was going to shoot me, but changed his mind when I reminded him that I had saved his life by raising money to spring him from the Devil's Island settlement on the mainland at Cayenne. Anyhow, we got to Aachen and put up at the Hotel Monopole in Jakobstrasse. I took the baths. The carnival was in full swing. Eddie tried to rob a jewelry store and failed. Then he and Ed Rice went on to Italy. I was told to stay put and that I would get a fur coat and be taken to Norway as a reward. He wanted to keep me away from baby Thompson. While he was gone, I got acquainted with a young German officer. He took me to Cologne and West Baden. I robbed him of small amounts during the entire trip, but he was poor, and the pickings were not so good. Back I came to my headquarters. Along came a letter from Guerin ordering me to join him in Italy. Instead of that, I went back to London and rejoined baby Thompson. I preferred him to the domineering Guerin. The babe was a good fellow, always had plenty of money, and had a dandy car. At first he was raving mad at me, but I promised him never to go with Guerin again, so we made up. In the meanwhile, however, Eddie got back to Germany and sent me the fur coat from Berlin, where he had made a haul, the Italian trip not having been so successful. Skinner phoned me one day to go to her apartment, and when I got there, Eddie was waiting for me, mad as a hornet. This was the cold spring of, I think, 1905. He beat me up and took away the fur coat. I trailed Eddie and his accomplice, John the waiter, until I saw where they pawned the coat. I put a stop order on the coat to prevent them from getting it out, but I never got it. This was the time Thompson sent me to South America to avoid trouble with Guerin, who was making threats that he was going to disfigure me so that my face would never lure another man. I was to be made hideous to look at. After I'd served my long stretch in Aylesbury, England, and had started to work again in this country, I heard of an opportunity of getting even with the English for the way they had treated me, and of nicking one of the aristocrats who had been to blame for my unjust sentence. How I got this information is another matter. Suffice it to say that I got it. I went over to England on the passport of a Red Cross nurse, fooling the American authorities. I was in London several weeks, fooling Scotland Yard. Then John came my way, and I and a friend of his trimmed him good and proper. My share more than paid all my expenses and left me considerable over, so much so that I did not have to do much work for a year afterwards. It is too dangerous to give the name of the sucker the event happened to recently. If he reads this, he will know, and he will know what a bally ass he was. Once when I was down at Brighton for a few weeks taking the air and enjoying the promenade, I happened to spy a very nifty coat in Henry Hilder's tailor store, 14 Trafalgar Street. As I was having a vacation and did not want to work, I would not go steal the coat myself, but I wanted it just the same. I waited until I met a boy who was a real burglar and asked him if he would do me a favor. When he said he would, I told him of my craving for the coat, which I showed him. He said it was too small potatoes to bother with, and offered to buy me one. Nothing would do, but I must have that one, and it had to be stolen. He got it for me in the way prescribed, and it cost me more than the value of the coat for the meal and liquor I stood him. I shall never forget Armistice Day, 1918. Temporarily, I was in Philadelphia. By way of celebration, I trimmed a sucker that night in a doorway in Brandywine Street, near where the Harmony Singing Society used to have its clubhouse. He had more than $500 in large bills, which I got. If I had had more time, I might have gotten more. That same night, I robbed a so-called Russian nobleman in a hotel at 9th and Chestnut Streets. He must have been robbed before by some Bolshevik, for I only pulled a couple of dirty 10 spots out of him. At times when I've been in Brighton, the English Atlantic City, we used to steal on the ocean front where the fashionable stores were. On one occasion, Kid Wilson stole 4 valuable sable neckpieces while I was fitting on a blouse. That is the way we used to get our own wearing apparel. We never bought any there. Pauline Washburn and myself used to sit on the beach at night and start crying when some old stuffer would come along. If the Limey sat down beside us to console us, Paulie would get his pocketbook before you could say Jack Robinson. The two of us worked this racket at different watering places with varying success. One night we went to Yarmouth, famous for bloaters and for being the scene of some of David Copperfield's experiences. This was a tough place, something like what Coney Island used to be. Well, an Irishman came to console me. I was so slow with my sleight of hand, for the Irishman's eye was quicker than my hand, that he caught me with the poke in my mitt. Biff! He hit me over the head with his cudgel just as effectively as if it was a shillelagh. He got his pocketbook back all right, and we bawled each other out. If I hadn't been so bunged up and he had been rich enough or prominent enough to make it worthwhile, I would have stood by until a cop had arrested us. Then I would have framed him by planting something of mine on him and badgering him. It might have developed into blackmail. The result was, however, after the battle, that I had to have several stitches put into my head. I bear the mark to this day in the shape of a scar, which fortunately is covered by the hair of my shock head. End of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of Chicago, May, Her Story, by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Toward the Setting Sun. Although I had been in Detroit frequently from the beginning of my career as a crook and onwards, I'd never stopped there long enough to pull more than one job and then beat it. In the early days there were no automobiles, the business section was small, and the dwelling houses were mostly built on separate lots, with plenty of in-between space. In 1899 there was one gas machine in town, and the citizens used to go to the curb to watch it when it ambled by. The Griswold house was the principal hostelry, comfortable but not up to date. I did not really settle down in Detroit to follow my trade until the early part of 1924. By that time the town had become a city. The hotels were big and modern, and business was active. Money was being made and money was being spent. The field was ripe for the reaper, but my sun had begun to set. What I lacked in youth and energy, however, I more than made up in the cunning of experience. I was very careful and played safe. No one knew who I was. I played a lone hand. Occasionally I would be pinched for loitering or for that much abused charge of disorderly conduct which only means what it says. The law is very explicit, but police and magistrates define it to include nearly everything. Few appeals are taken. The fact that I was stealing never entered the heads of the cops. There was no complaint from the Johns. I stopped taking a man's whole roll, though I would take liberally. The result was that I began to save money and have visions once more of retiring from the racket for good. After a while my arrests became more numerous. I did not belong to the syndicate. Certain officers, bondsmen, and lawyers were in cahoots. They made a fat living off the unfortunate girls, the bloodsuckers and scoundrels. The business of the vice squad was to pick up 50 or 60 girls one night a week for investigation. This night was timed for Saturday, when the prisoners would be held over for a hearing until Monday, unless they got out on a writ. The procurers or agents knew this, and so did the shyster lawyers. Round to the detention house they would go, and collect from $35 to $50 from the girls who could afford or raise the money. The lawyer would then take the writs to a judge to sign. Most of the other judges would be out to Lake St. Clair for the weekend. By the time the vice squad was off duty Saturday night, the girls would be out again, working in the streets. They had to hustle for their wages and the costs and expenses of the law. They continued to work until the next pickup, hoping and praying it would be far enough off so that they could get a little ahead of the game. All the girls were registered at the Board of Health and had their slips sent in. Most of the girls visited a woman doctor who made a fat income because, in addition, she examined and reported on the girls who did not stand in with the system. No woman was allowed to go out on a writ unless her slip was in the hands of the Board of Health certifying that she was in good condition. I was never registered in Detroit or in any other city because that was not my line. Although I've often been accused of being an ordinary street walker, it was very seldom that a John ever got as far as being intimate with me. I never laid out my money for writs, but just took my chance with the judge. Except in a very few instances, I always got off or was put on probation. You can well imagine if the judge had known me, he would hardly have put me on probation. I worked inconspicuously. My days for fame and the spotlight were over. One day I went down Park Boulevard and picked up a swell guy in a car. Before we got very far, I had taken his leather. We were parked near a gasoline station. Up came a Ford law car. Two burly bulls jumped on us. I had presence of mind enough to put the wallet into the John's outside coat pocket. They scared the poor sucker so badly that he ups and tells them he was taking me to a hotel and had promised to give me $10. Both of us were taken to the police station, and that was my first arrest in Detroit. I cried and whimpered. The matrons were very sorry, and I was put with the first offenders. The next day in court it was more like a cheap burlesque show than a place for the trial of criminal cases. The girls in the bullpen kept saying to me, "Get a lawyer. This judge is a bugger." I looked him over, decided he was a good, decent Irishman, and passed up the idea of wasting money on a lawyer. When my case was called, there was my John. He took the stand and told the court the yarn. "Well," says the judge, looking at me, "what have you to say?" I told him I was a hard-working, respectable woman, that my husband deserted me with 2 small children, and that I had come to Detroit trying to get a job of some sort. When he asked the cops if they had ever seen me before, they said no. "She tells me a very straightforward story," said His Honor. "She doesn't look or act like one of these prostitutes." Here the cop made a tactical error, saying, "But she was willing to go with a man for money." The judge snapped out, "There are hundreds of women in Detroit and elsewhere who accept money from men, and they wouldn't thank you for calling them hustlers or street walkers. Discharged." When I walked out, I didn't have enough money in my pocket to even ride home in a taxicab. It was not long, however, before I was again in funds. I worked more cautiously than ever. I scraped and saved, never spending more than I earned, even when business was bad. On occasions I made worthwhile hauls, but I would not allow myself to squander them. My ambition was to get back to my former estate in the matter of clothing and jewels. A crook, like any other businessman, must generally put up a front to succeed well. Bit by bit I was forging ahead when I ran into an Italian contractor who looked good to me. He worked hard, made a good living, was not too sanctimonious, liked me, and could give me the background I needed. We started to live together. Each worked, and both of us made more money than we did when we were playing lone hands. I was generous with him, and he was equally liberal with me. When one was dull, the other was prospering. It was seldom that we both were playing in hard luck at the same time. Notwithstanding, he was a pretty good guy, I thought, at times. He had his hand out too frequently. The greed for the easy dollar is a great temptation for all but the strongest-minded of men. Among other things, I bought him a car, a radio set, and opened up a booze joint for him. He worked steadily enough. Once more I decided to go straight. I had an apartment where I lived with my man. His brother boarded with us. It was a great relief to settle down and just keep house. One day, going to the store for household supplies, a young Dick stopped me. I told him to go on about his own business, that I was a decent, respectable married woman. He accused me of being Irish, which I promptly admitted, and added that I was proud of it. Then he asked me how long I had been in the country. I laughed in his face and told him 6 months, kidding him. When I wouldn't produce any papers because I couldn't and didn't have to, he and 2 other dumbbells arrested me. They took me in a Ford to the Canfield station, charging me with violation of the immigration laws. When I got before the desk sergeant, I could hardly keep a straight face. He wanted to know what the hell sort of a case this was. He told the Dicks I wasn't an alien, and said they were fools. They insisted, however, that I had admitted that I was only in this country for 6 months, adding a few things I had never said. Anyhow, the wagon was called. It was early in the afternoon, and I had only my house dress on. The cop on the wagon said I was a pretty decent-looking woman to be charged with a crime. I said, "What crime?" When he looked at his papers and saw the crime was violating the immigration laws, he nearly fell off the seat laughing and tittered all the way to the detention home. He was Irish, too. In a few hours, a federal official came along. I was crying and laughing at the ridiculousness of the charge and from fear of an investigation which would expose me to the Detroit authorities. It did not take me long, however, to convince Uncle Sam's servant that the Dicks had pulled a bonehead. He was more peeved than I was when he ordered my release. I was tickled to death. After the lawyer got me out of the unlawful pinch in Philadelphia, I went home to Detroit, imitating, as nearly as might be, the flight of a crow. The reason for this was what I hadn't told the lawyer, that I was on probation in Detroit. I knew the Philadelphia courts were very methodical, investigating their cases. Before I even had a chance to get out of Philly, a woman from the court was round to see me. I gave her my right address in Detroit and the name of the man I said I was the wife of. My friend had a good name, and the apartment was very respectable. I was afraid they would start a checkup, and I decided it was best to tell the truth, not having anything to hide in that respect. It is true, however, that I spoke in broken English and gave my age as 10 years less than was right. They sent this poor description to the Detroit probation office. I took a train home via Buffalo and landed in the Michigan Central Station, Detroit, at 2 a.m. My man met me and took me to our apartment in his car. About 9 o'clock that morning, the local probation officer was there to inquire about me. She was surprised to see me back so soon, slapped me on the back, and told me never to go east again. She told me how the manager told her I had gone to New York to visit my sister. As she did not know me, she was not wise to the fact that there was a warrant out for me under another name for violation of parole. She said she was going to write Philadelphia and explain to them that they had made a mistake, that I had a husband who had a good character and a good home. It seems that society is getting so complicated with reform, uplift, and law that the authorities are not able to unravel the twisted skein. And now comes one of the bad breaks in my life. Or perhaps it was a good break. I was sick. I was very sick. My man got $1,000 out of our bank and gave it to me to go to Chicago to have an operation. As I have explained elsewhere, I simply loafed around the Windy City and spent the money. When I came back, he was sore because I had not done as promised. We had a fight, so I took $500, left him, and opened a nice apartment in Stimson Street with another girl. I was too sick to work. One Sunday morning, I went to the drugstore in 2nd Boulevard to get some medicine. It was in August 1926. A car drove up with 2 rum runners from New York. They knew me simply as a girl who knocked about, not as Chicago May. They were driving my way and gave me a friendly lift. The car was full of all kinds of booze. Up came a law car, stopped us, and asked the boys if I had solicited them. They had guilty consciences and became frightened. Seeing this, I tried to make a getaway. The cop ran after and caught me. The boys escaped in the confusion. To accomplish this, I had confessed I had been soliciting. At that, I might have beaten the case. Only the probation woman who sat near the bench recognized me, told Judge Brennan I was a very bad woman, and that there was a warrant out for me for violation of probation. 60 days, said the old dog. I hope you are stiff up there, I cried, until I come out of the can. When I went to the bullpen, a lawyer shouted and asked if any of the girls wanted to get out and appeal. Give me out, I said, and I handed him $100. He couldn't get a judge to sign the release until morning, so I had to go to the House of Correction. Of all the jails I ever struck, that was the worst. Blacks and whites had to sleep together on the floor on straw mattresses. This is the place where Loretta Lee, the girl bandit, died from exposure. After a sleepless night, I was sitting in the yard waiting to get out. Along came a matron and told me I was going to work in the laundry. I told her I was not going to work, but was going out as soon as my lawyer arrived. She told me I would have to do as I was told. I explained that I was sick and told her she could have me examined to prove whether or no I was telling her the truth. She simply said, sick or not, you are going to work in the laundry or go to the dungeon. Sure enough, they took me to the dungeon. I laid down on the flags and fell asleep from exhaustion. Before I awoke, the door opened. I was shaken and told that my lawyer had arrived. You must be a tough bird, volunteered the matron, but if you ever come back here again, we will take the toughness out of you. I flipped back. You wouldn't have a job if the likes of me didn't come here, unless you did scrubbing for a living. You are too ugly to catch a man and too dumb to steal. The matron who took me from the dungeon told me to pick up a scrap of paper I had thrown on the floor. She wanted to show off in front of the other girls. I told her to pick it up herself, so that was all she got for her wasted bluff. Imagine my surprise when I got to the office to be told that there was a detainer against me for violation of probation. After all the times I'd been guilty and escaped this charge, they had finally tumbled to me. I was taken to the county jail in the hurry-up wagon. This institution was very fine for a jail. The matrons were very nice to me. A dope fiend who remembered me from New York pen tipped me off about the chief matron, Mrs. Rexford, a good woman. She saw that I was sick and insisted that I be removed to the receiving hospital. I was treated there for a week when the doctors discovered that I had kidney stones. The chief surgeon, also named Rexford, but not related to the chief matron, said to me, "You're going to die in a few months if you are not operated on. You have 1 chance in 100 for a successful operation. You have waited too long. It is impossible for you to live with that quarry in your side." I had a hunch that this doctor was all to the good, so I told him to go to it. He laughed, said all right, and in a few days I was on the operating table. I had no fear of death. My vitality was at a low ebb. I had little hope of pulling through, but I still had the will to live. I saw neither priest nor parson, for I feared a bad judge more than I did God. They strapped me on the operating table, gave me an anesthetic, and I remembered no more for about 10 hours. I was told they took me from one ward to another, fearing I would pass out. The coming back was worse than the going out. The first thing I remember was a nurse remonstrating with me for pulling off a towel and leggings, trying to toss them on the floor. My condition was good for a few days, and then I had a relapse. Now came the struggle with death. When I felt I was slipping, I would tell them, and they and I fought off the enemy. The doctors and nurses were wonderful, particularly a good-looking one, Dr. Nathanson from Minnesota. He hung on to me as if I was the dearest friend he had ever had professionally. Nobody could have done more or better than he did. By this time the newspapers had gotten on to my name and history. Harvey Clemmer of the Detroit News was the only one of the reporters who was allowed in to see me. He tipped off the other boys and treated me with the greatest consideration. When I was able to move, the police had the bracelets on me, and I was chained to the bed. My wrists were so small by that time that they had to pull the nippers into the last link. The doctors protested, but the dicks insisted and won. Some of the cops were humane. My friends would slip me cigars to give to the attendants. Once I was caught passing some of them to a window cleaner. They made a terrible fuss, saying I was scheming to escape. During my stay in the prison hospital, I witnessed a near-deathbed scene. I still was chained to the bed. One night they brought in a beautiful English girl shot through the lungs by a gangster. She was hardly undressed when 2 bulls from the homicide squad arrived to grill her. One on each side kept asking her who shot her. She was in mortal agony, a young intern wiping the blood and froth from her lips. One of the house doctors kept telling her to confess so that they could treat her. Along came the district attorney. Then they brought in a string of gunmen, gangsters, and underworld boys of all rackets. She would shake her head that she did not know them when they filed past her bed. I was 2 cots from her, and held up my chained hand so that she could see it. She gave me a sweet, wan smile of sympathy. When the bulls were not looking, I would put my fingers to my lips and shake my head. She nodded understandingly, but oh, ever so faintly. They kept at her all through the night. I often wondered how the kid lived, but she did live and was still alive the last time I heard from her. I've gone through a plenty in my life, but that scene was the most impressive I ever had any experience with. There was the death light burning, the nurse at the foot of the bed, and the kind young intern at the head, giving the stricken child medicine and soothing her, tears of sympathy in his eyes. Another young girl was in a nearby bed, sobbing quietly. 2 hard-boiled dicks were torturing their victim, trying to fasten the guilt on somebody, whether or no. I, the hardened sinner, was the spectator, chained so that I could not escape, helpless, choking with fury. After a long time the poor baby slept, and I had a chat with the intern. He said the nagging and excitement were liable to kill the patient, but that youth and vitality were on her side. That kid certainly stood the test that night in Detroit. Her friends visited me also. They were from New York, where she used to live, and were swell gunmen. Finally, I was discharged from the hospital, and the police took me back to the county jail. I was put into a private room and had every attention. There I stayed until my case for violation of probation was called. I forgot to say I was visited by August Vollmer, the chief of police of Berkeley, California, while I was in the hospital. I speak of him elsewhere as the good-hearted bull, who was practical enough to say something more than merely "go straight, it doesn't pay, you can't win," etc. He showed me one way to make an honest living. He put the bug into my head to at least try to write for a living. Accompanying him was Elmer Harris, the moving picture director for Cecil DeMille. They came several times with beautiful flowers. It was the kindness and courtesy of these people and others which caused me to make another try to get on the bandwagon with most of the people in society. When my case came up, the letter of the law demanded that I be punished. There was no doubt I had violated my probation. I knew, in addition, what the authorities did not know, that I had violated it on numerous occasions. Morally, I deserved the rap on all counts. I could not have had a kick coming if I had been given what I deserved. But Judge Cotter was a practical man and listened to reasons not found in law books. Inspector Lowley spoke to him, urging the desirability of giving me a chance now that I was down and out. He was backed up by Mrs. Clara Lightsring, who had charge of my case, and Mrs. Rexford, the social worker. The fact that women were fighting on my side gave me a new thrill. Theretofore it had been the dames who, 9 times out of 10, had treated me unfairly and tried to push my head under water. Now it was the people whom the newspaper boys call the sob sisters who were willing to forgive. The question of creed even made no difference, as in the case of the ladies of the Woodward Avenue Baptist Church. It did not seem to matter to them when they came to see me every day and brought flowers that I'd been a liar, a thief, a badger, a blackmailer, and a con woman. It likewise did not seem to matter to them when I told them it was incomprehensible to me how criminals could get religion at the end of their careers. When I kicked free, I went to board with a respectable family. The bill was paid by Walter Latimer, a reformer who has no more money than the law allows, but who feels called upon by the Lord to help criminals go straight. He stakes them until they get on their feet. He certainly ought to get his reward on earth as well as in heaven, because he does his stuff so quietly and unostentatiously. As soon as I could catch my breath, I started writing to newspapers, magazines, book publishers, and writers' managers to see if I could break in on the author game. After considerable disappointment, I was encouraged by the receipt of a letter from Morrill Goddard, manager of the New York American Weekly, enclosing money for transportation to come for an interview with him. He also inquired if I knew his old friend Sophie Lyons. So I went east once more, this time to do a different kind of work from what I had been in the habit of doing. The result was 5 illustrated Sunday stories in the weekly during the latter part of the summer of 1927. The pay for this work was so satisfactory that I started to make arrangements to write this book, which deals with my whole life instead of a few incidents. In the writing of the newspaper stories and in the course of my negotiations for publishing the book, I've been under deep obligation to Travis Hoke, an all-round star newspaper man on the American staff. After I had finished my work in New York and had some money for more than the bare necessities of life, I decided to try a couple of health resorts, hoping to recover completely from my operations. I forgot to say that the first operation in Detroit was not a complete success. The second time I was cut open, the doctor did a better job, apparently. This was not because he did not do all that was humanly possible the first time. When he tackled me in the second round, I was in better condition to stand punishment. As I was saying, I went in quest of health. First, I tried Ocean City for a few weeks. That did some good. Then I went to the Pocono Mountains. That did more good. Then I went to Philadelphia, where I got down to work on this autobiography. It may interest the reading public and others to know some of the difficulty of trying to be a reformed crook, and the kindness of some bulls who have official duties to perform. When I got fairly started writing this life history, the Dicks and Phillies spotted me going to my apartment. The next thing I knew, I was taken up to City Hall for examination and told to get out of town in 24 hours. I was completely upset until a legit friend and lawyer went personally to Captain of Detectives Charles Beckman. When it was explained to him what I was doing, he said he would be the last one in the world to push anybody down who was trying to get up. I was given as much time as I wanted to finish the work. I was helped officially, and I was not bothered subsequently. End of chapter 34. Chapter 35 of Chicago May, Her Story by May Churchill Sharpe. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Au revoir, but not goodbye. This business of being an author has its humorous and interesting as well as its serious side. It would astonish most people to see my mail. My old friends in the police write me letters of encouragement. Christians feel called upon to send me platitudes. Reformers insist upon drawing their pet theories to my attention. Professional crooks berate and praise me. Beggars importune me. Sycophants flather me with adulation. The rich and others patronize me. If ever I become rich or near rich, I'm going to help criminals in my own way. Getting one of them a good job is all right in the case of the individual, but improving conditions so that all of them who want to work for a living wage can get jobs is better. An old age pension is all right for those brave souls who work all their lives and resist the temptation to crime, provided it does not tend to reduce wages while they are working. Institutions like the YMCA, no matter how laudable their objects, enable the few to work for less wages than their fellows, because the charity gives them better home conditions than the ones who marry and raise families. Benefits must be general, not special. Some way must be devised to give everybody a job at a decent wage who is able and willing to work. Public ownership of public utilities would be a starter. The abolition of the profit system, taking industries one at a time in the order in which they are important to the life of the community, would be the next series of steps. Private operation of fair wages is not antagonistic to this principle. If this is socialism, make the worst of it. I am an individualist, but I can't see why grain elevators shouldn't be socialized just as much as coal mines. In general, there is no such thing as a diseased mind among criminals as such. The average crook is out to make a living just like the honest man. There are stupid men in business. There are degenerate men and women who are very talented. Also, there are clever writers and actors who are dope fiends. In the same way, one meets people like that in the underworld. It is the bunk to try to treat criminals as if they were sick. Just as in medicine, the real remedy is to remove the cause of the disease. The criminal must be treated before and not after he becomes a criminal. Give the young people a living wage so that they can live and dress and amuse themselves like human beings, and there will be very few criminals. There is another way of looking at the criminal class. Once a man or woman gets the taste of the chase and brings down the game, he or she continues like the sportsman. There is danger and glory in hunting the tiger. On the other hand, very few people hunt tigers for sport. I myself never stole for the fun of stealing. I wasn't built that way. I wanted money or revenge, more money than I could make honestly, or more chance to punish the animal that injured me and my fellows. Violence breeds violence. Every time a new punishment or deterrent is devised, a new counter is developed to offset it. Depth bombs came after submarines. The torch was used against Harveyized steel safes. Bootlegging improved in method with the introduction of poisoned liquor to make people sober. There never was a time in the history of the world when men were as adventuresome, as daring and brave as they are today. Men fly airplanes and dig bridge foundations in caissons. Do you think that mere punishment is going to make people good? Let me attempt to tell you just a little more about myself, and then I will have done. I've not played cards for 20 years. Though I used to play poker for stakes and act as banker in friendly games, I've gambled at the roulette wheel in Monte Carlo and Rio de Janeiro, and at the races at Ascot, Brighton, and other places. No, I never played solitaire, what the English call patience, because I have no patience, not being built for a recluse. I never saw the execution of a criminal, and what is more, I wouldn't see one. Such things encourage murders. I have, however, seen the results of suicide, poison in the world, and hanging in jail. It has been my sad duty to look up friends in the morgue. Gunplay is not one of my usual experiences, though I know something about it. I've heard shots fired in anger. Personally, I prefer a revolver to an automatic because the former is not so complicated as the latter and is less likely to get out of order at the critical point. A .32 is not too large to be used by ladies. I have blackjacked and been blackjacked. Dope I abhor because I dislike its smell and its taste. I've tried it out of curiosity and to study its effect. The evil results of heroin especially frighten me. You can't be cured once the habit gets you unless you want to be cured and will it, in spite of all the suffering involved in stopping. The only way I know how to stop is to stop. I'm not so sure the doctor's way of tapering off is the best way. It isn't the best way coming off a drunk, though you may suffer more by a sudden stop than by slowing down gradually. Speaking of liquor, I've drunk almost every kind known to man, from beer and ale to brandy or whiskey and soda and champagne. I am especially fond of Amer Pecan, the North African grape tonic liquor, the way the Boulevardier drinks it in Paris. A shot in a tall tumbler of iced grenadine. Once I got drunk on absinthe, but it gave me a frightful headache. For that matter, though, I prefer not to get drunk at all, and do not, if I can help it. I would rather get drunk on whiskey than on champagne. The latter is so lasting in its final kick, especially when you have been drinking the kind of the French drink, the still wine. No, I'm never tempted to steal just because I see an easy chance to do so. I used to steal because I wanted money and could not get work which would pay me enough to live on. I never stole for the mere pleasure of stealing. I'm not a kleptomaniac. There is no particular feeling of virtue on my part when I am not stealing. The benefit to me in money, safety, comfort, and lack of worry is what I calculate and what appeals to me as against the nerve-wracking gamble of being caught. I enjoy swimming, horsebacking, and rowing. When I get an opportunity, I indulge all these. The exercise of dancing is very fascinating to me. I drive a motor car, but I have no need for one now. In my business, I can't afford one at the present time, merely for pleasure. I learned to play the piano as a child in Dublin and in London. I picked up dancing naturally in dance halls and on roof gardens. I speak English, French, and Portuguese, and smoke cigarettes. As to the use of money by crooks to escape from legal punishment, I could say a mouthful. The bribe-giver and the bribe-taker are equally guilty, so it is hard to secure evidence. Each side to the bribery transaction is equally interested in keeping a closed mouth. Then, too, it is considered dishonorable to split on the other fellow. Usually the exposure comes when the giver finds the go-between has lied about the transaction, either copying off all of the money or a large portion of it. Lawyers are often hypocrites and liars at this game. In general, money counts for more in America than in England. The judges in the latter country are paid too much in the way of salaries to be reached, and they have a social standing they are afraid to jeopardize. In the same country, the attendant officials are paid so little that they are slaves to their sanctimonious masters. Nationality, religion, social standing, and political faith have considerable to do with the treatment of those accused of crime. Some judges are 101% American, their families having been in the United States for a couple of generations. From the bench, even they prove themselves by showing their prejudice against, say, a poor Russian Jew who speaks in broken English. As there are many Catholic judges in court and prison officials, it helps to be a Catholic. I don't mean to say they do not generally carry out the law and observe the rules, but they are bound to have their judgments influenced. This applies equally to Protestants. A Methodist judge is more likely to think a liquor violation is treason than any other sort of a judge would. Strikers and socialists are up against a lot of prejudices when they get into court. I suppose this is because the representatives of the established order are afraid for their jobs. No, I'm not sorry for what I've done. I broke the law, was caught, and paid the price. My crimes were against the rules laid down by society. You lose unless you are lucky, if you do not follow the regulations. In France, the court may decree you a relégué, forbid you to enter a certain city or district. I've never had such a sentence imposed upon me. In the United States, the police may order you to leave a certain city. They have no authority to do so, but they can make it so unpleasant for a criminal that he has to obey unless he can afford to resist. I am a renegade or deportee, having had that distinction conferred upon me twice. Bracelets were only put on me once in my career, in Detroit, when I was in the hospital. I never invested my savings. Occasionally I received interest on bank deposits, but that was purely accidental so far as I was concerned. I recall, though, that once I did buy some lots to encourage a crook who was trying to make an honest living. As I made no further payments on them after the first, I suppose that could hardly be called an investment. The only Liberty bonds I ever owned were the ones I stole, and I did not keep them long enough to clip the coupons. At various times I have associated with crooks who came from good families. For some reason or other, I always felt sorry for them. It seemed too bad to me that they did not have an opportunity to go straight, no matter what the cause. There was the phony kid, for instance, who was the son of a Pittsburgh doctor. There was another boy whose father was a rich broker. Then there was the case of the girl who was driven from home because she had a baby before she went through a man-made marriage ceremony. God Almighty may surprise her parents some day when He pronounces judgment. For a woman of 52, come next birthday, I'm well preserved. My hair is still light red, and there is plenty of it. In stature, I'm 5 feet 6 inches. My weight is 165 pounds. It is not necessary for me to use glasses except to read the telephone book. I do, however, use them when I have a lot of reading or writing to do. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than to sit at home at night, talking to a few intelligent friends. When I wander from my own fireside, I prefer a light opera to the cinema, but I must have somebody with me for company. You see, I am gregarious, if the herd is small. Otherwise, I am fond still of night life, but principally as an onlooker. And so I come to the end of my autobiography. It is not all here. Many details are lacking, but it ought to give a fair idea of my life. It is true. Possibly there are some errors as to dates and names, but I've tried in good faith to show my true self without glossing over my weaknesses or faults. You may hear from me again, and in a more constructively interesting manner. End of Chapter 35. End of Chicago May, Her Story by May Churchill Sharpe.